What makes a Gibson ES-345? That might seem like an entirely ridiculous question, but it's actually got some pretty cool ins and outs that we're going to talk about today. We're going to go over my really awesome, if I do say so myself, Gibson Memphis ES-345 reissue. This is kind of a unique one that they did for a number of years. And we're also going to talk to my good pal Steve Sterlacci, who has a 1972 ES-345, and hear a little bit about his experience with that. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy. So what makes a Gibson ES-345? Why would you even ask that question? A couple of unique things here that's leading me down this road. Gibson currently offers a Gibson ES-345. It looks like a great guitar. It has the awesome parallelogram inlays. It comes in a, there's a great cherry red finish with chrome hardware, and that's it. I kind of looked at it and I thought, now, first of all, let me preface this by saying, I don't love to hate Gibson. I actually love Gibson guitars. I'm an avid Gibson guitar player. I have been pretty much since I started playing guitar. I'm not going to just make excuses for them, but I'm also not going to just tear them down for no reason just because they have the name Gibson on them. Here's the thing about that guitar. I'm sure it's a great guitar. I've actually never been disappointed with a Gibson Memphis guitar, with an ES guitar, electric Spanish. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. The thing that got me about this guitar was that, well, it's really just an ES-335 with parallelogram inlays, because traditionally there were a few different things that separated the 345 from the other guitars in the line. Now, in 1958, Gibson came out with 3 thin-line semi-hollow body guitars, the most famous of which, obviously, that many of you know, is the Gibson ES-335, used by anybody and everybody. It's one of the greatest electric guitars ever made. The middle ground was the ES-345, and then the high-end one was the ES-355, which was essentially like the Custom, right? Like the Les Paul Custom, the SG Custom. That one had the fancy binding. It had the ebony fingerboard with block inlays and the diamond inlay on the headstock. Now, the difference between the 335 and the 345 was when you got the 345, you had gold parts, you also had the parallelogram inlays, but then you had 2 other really unique features. You had the Veritone switch. And the Veritone switch, you can go into a whole thing about what this is. Essentially, it's a 6-way filter switch. That's basically what it is. When you're on the number 1 setting, you've got your full-on humbuckers, and then at each different setting, you've got some type of a different filter, which gives you some of those really plucky old blues tones. They get thinner and thinner as you kind of go down the line. So a lot of people don't use the ones, down 5 and 6, but you will get some people who use 2 and 3. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. You had the Veritone switch, and then you had stereo. The ES-345 was functioning stereo guitar. Now, those features were also on the 355. The 355 I'm going to give a total pass to, whether it has any of those features or not, just because that's the custom level one again. It's, all that one really needs is the ebony and the block inlays and the diamond inlay. So, but the 345, that really the thing that separates that from the 335 are the aesthetics and those two functionalities. So again, I kind of look at this guitar and I'm like, well, that's just a 335 with parallelogram inlays. So like, why would I get that instead of just paying a little less money for a 335 with either dots or blocks? But then the counterpoint to that argument is that it is Gibson, it is their guitar, they can do what they want with it, and historically speaking, many players have bypassed both of those features. Many players in the vintage ones ripped out the stereo setup and went with a standard mono setup because it was so much more convenient. You didn't have to use a stereo cable. You know, it just worked more like a traditional guitar setup, and it was just easier. And the stereo thing, I think, in the 50s and 60s never quite took off like some of the guitar companies thought that it would. The Veritone switch, there's a lot of people who think it just sounds like garbage. I think there's some cool usable tones in there, but they are very, very stylistic. It's not necessarily a selling feature for me. I think you can get some really cool old blues tones. You actually heard some of those in the beginning when I was doing the very, very beginning clean tone that was on the number 3 setting, and then the first solo with some overdrive was also on the number 3 setting, which happens to be my favorite. Sometimes I like to use that for a slightly thinner sound and then kick it up to the number 1 setting, which is full on. It's almost like having an onboard boost. But again, it's not a necessary feature for me tonally, but it is a necessary feature for me regarding what constitutes what a 345 is. Now, again, kind of going down the line of the counterpoint to the argument. It is Gibson's guitar. If they say it's a 345, who am I to say otherwise? And there was a unique other case where I was on the other side of this, which was with the Fender Jazzmaster. This was a custom Fender Jazzmaster that they did a number of years ago. It had a flame top and it had dual wide range humbuckers. It was a really cool looking guitar. But the Jazzmaster players were all kinds of up in arms about it because this wasn't a Jazzmaster. This didn't have the right pickups and it didn't have the rhythm switch. And, you know, I have to admit, I was shocked. I couldn't believe that the Jazzmaster players could get so easily offended by anything. But that being said, my argument there was, well, you know, this a Jazzmaster body shape, it's a Jazzmaster neck, and it's Fender making it, and Fender owns the Jazzmaster, so if you say, hey, you know, Fender says this is Jazzmaster, it's a Jazzmaster. But where do you draw the line, right? Because the early SGs were in fact Les Pauls. And even if you see one of the really old SGs that was technically a Les Paul, pretty much everyone calls it an SG. Or, if anything, they call it an SG/Les Paul. So, at what point is a guitar not the guitar that it claims to be? It's an interesting question. I did bring up, by the way, electric Spanish. This is kind of unique, kind of going back to just the time period that we're talking about here. A lot of people I've heard say, you know, kind of what's the deal with it being called electric Spanish? Like, why would it need to be called that? Well, you have to remember in the 1950s when these guitars were around, and, you know, of course the ES insignia goes earlier than that. You have to remember that in World War II, you had a lot of GIs over in Hawaii and Polynesia in general exposed to that type of music, and one of the most popular things in that era was the Hawaiian guitar. So the ES Electric Spanish was actually differentiating that from the, as opposed to a Hawaiian type guitar. Spanish guitar, Hawaiian guitar, two totally different things, differentiating that. It's interesting to think about when you look back on the time period that we often don't think about anymore. So we're going to get back to a little bit of tone here. Now, mine is a modern Gibson Memphis ES-345 reissue. Now, mine misses 2 of the check boxes of the original 345s. It does not have stereo. Again, many players just kind of ripped that out. Many players ripped the Veritone out, so I think Gibson was just sort of trying to streamline what everyone was doing anyway. The other thing that mine does not have is it does not have the gold parts. Now, I am going to give mine a pass on that because it's also a really cool custom finish, which is seafoam green, and seafoam green just looks cooler with some level of the silver finish. So right now we're just going to hear that guitar. We're going to hear it on the neck pickup for a really, really luscious clean. Today I'm plugging into my Marshall JVM. When we do some overdriven tones, I'm using a Vick Audio Lotus Overdrive, which I'm using not only because it's a great sounding pedal, but also because it matches my guitar perfectly. And we're going to hear some tone, then we're going to talk to Steve and hear a little bit about his 1972 ES-345. So I mentioned my pal Steve Sterlacci has an awesome 1972 Gibson ES-345 that actually had all the original bells and whistles that we've been talking about. So Steve is here with us to tell us about this really cool guitar. How's it going, Steve?
What's up, Jack? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for being on here. You got your guitar there with you.
I do. So this is. You want me? I'll do a quick little close-up shot of the guitar here, so y'all could see it. There's a couple things that make this 72 special that I'm sure we can get into, but.
Sure, and for anybody who is interested in all the kind of details of this guitar, I'm going to link right up above to a video where Steve talks all about this kind of in-depth. But in that video, you talk about kind of the two dominant features of the 345, one you kept and one you didn't, and that's obviously the Veritone being the sort of underappreciated but really cool one, and the stereo, which just never quite made it the way that I think Gibson intended it to. So what was your experience with that?
Yeah, so I mean, I was looking up so many things and looking up for different workarounds. Originally, I guess they literally wanted you to go into two different amps. Like their original plan was that each pickup goes to a separate amp, I guess, instead of being able to just select them into one amp. So with that mentality, I mean, I'm never in a situation like that. So when I would plug in like a stereo to dual mono, I had a phase box. Like they sell a little box that that you can flip the polarity so that the in-between position is then in phase, but then you always needed the special Y cable. And it was just another piece of gear that I didn't feel like I needed to have at all times. And I love the guitar so much that it's like my number one player, that if like I had to choose, like I want to play one guitar, it's probably this one. It's my favorite playing and sounding guitar, but the stereo thing was just more headache than it was worth, always trying to find workarounds, because I mean, that in-between position being out of phase is cool. Like that whole like Peter Green, Gary Moore thing.
Sure.
The way that I play, I use the middle position all the time. That's kind of like one of my main rhythm sounds, is working the two humbuckers together. So having that out of phase was definitely it was a buzzkill for me. So I wound up ripping it all out, and I did all new electronics in the guitar. And I had my tech flip the magnet of the neck pickup so that it's now in phase.
No, and you know, the interesting thing about that too is that you get so many of those cool, they're not out of phase, but they're filtered tones by using the Veritone switch, which kind of accomplishes a similar thing, that I don't know why you would need that out of phase sound in the middle anyway.
Yeah, it's something that you'd rather choose to have than be stuck with.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's just like if it were a switch where you could turn it off and on, that would be cool, but when that's your main tone, it's like, no thank you.
Yeah. And then for the Veritone, this is a Norlin era, obviously. If anyone isn't familiar with the Norlin era Gibson reputation, they weren't well known for their quality, and there's a lot of issues with Norlin eras, but this one has all of the right specs and all of the right stuff, but the wiring that was originally in this, it was like these gigantic pots that were encased, like they were not just pots, but they had a big metal case over them. And the original Veritone circuits had a separate choke that would be underneath here, right underneath the bridge here. And there was like a big piece of metal in there. And it was like a very over-engineered device. So I found this company called Delisle that makes a thing called a pentatone, which basically simplifies the circuit. And it's literally just a 6-position filter on the output. So it's like the last thing that goes before the output jack. So you still get all of the same qualities and the same EQ dips, like that carving out of the EQs. And it's a much simpler wiring. It's much better quality. Now that like I put all like the modern 50s era like quality components into it with that pentatone switch. And now it's even lighter too.
Yeah, I bet. And you know, one of the interesting things too is I actually I think you in particular not wanting the stereo feature is it's really like the nail in the coffin for me. And the reason I say that is because you're someone who works really heavily with a lot of modern, amp modelers, really high quality things like Helix and Fractal, where you could probably easily get the most out of a stereo setup like that. And so if you're not even doing that with modern equipment, let alone like the old style, then I can't imagine. I'm sure there are people out there who use the stereo and have it and swear by it, but I would think that, you know, if you, with all these sort of tools in your tool belt, aren't using that stereo, then it really did just somehow miss the mark.
Yeah, it definitely did for me. I mean, just the thought of, I mean, I travel a lot. We do a lot of touring. So just the thought of always needing that Y cable, always needing that extra box. I don't want to have extra gear. And if God forbid something happened to the cable, then I'm just screwed unless I had extra stereo Y cables, which that's the only application I would ever need them for. So it just wasn't worth all that headache.
Right, I get that. I totally get that. But that being said, obviously the bones of the guitar are really awesome. Now, how much of a difference is it for you having the Veritone switch versus just getting a 335? Like, is the Veritone a selling feature that really pushes it, or is it kind of more just, you know, we do always have these pictures of like just the guitars that we want. In the future, if you could go back and do it again, would you get it for the Veritone, or would you just go with a 335?
That's a tough one. The aesthetic of the 345, I think, is just unlike any other guitar in general. And I think that part of that aesthetic is having the chicken head knob with the gold dial around it. It's funny, like the Veritone is a thing where anytime you watch somebody use a Veritone in a video, you're like, oh man, that sounds so cool. That sounds so cool. But anytime you actually use the Veritone, you're like, oh man, this sounds like crap. This doesn't sound good at all. But then like you listen to even yourself using it, and you're like, oh, that's a cool tone. But
it's getting used to it when you're actually using it is, so the funny thing is I actually, there's like one setting on the Veritone that I do use, which is the number 3 setting. Now mine has a different, mine has the stock Veritone from a modern 345, so it's probably going to sound a little different than yours. But one of the things I'd like to do with mine is to keep it on the number 3 setting for some rhythm tones that get a little funkier, a little bit cleaner, and without that sort of robust low end, and then kick it up to the number 1 setting, the full-on humbuckers, as almost like an onboard boost. But that being said, it's not really, I don't know that I like the Veritone. I like it a lot more than other people do, I think, but I still don't know that I would get the guitar just because it had the Veritone. That wouldn't be an extra where it's like, well, I have to have that one because it's got the Veritone. You know what I mean?
yeah, I would say for me, it was a more aesthetic versus function. Like as far as function goes, like if I had an option to build a perfect ES-345 or a perfect semi-hollow guitar, it probably wouldn't include a Veritone out of choice.
Maybe just a dummy one on top for the looks.
Yeah, maybe. But I do like it. I like it. It's just not, I guess it's just not the most practical.
No, absolutely. It is a little tricky switching multiple settings on the fly on a, chicken head knob with 6 settings too.
And not knowing
Right.
what position you're in. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're on stage.
There have been times where I'd be at sound check and I'd be like, man, I got nothing today. Like, this just sounds so weird. And like, my sound is just so thin. Something's wrong with our in-ears or something's wrong with the monitoring. And then I'd be like, oh, I'm in position 4 for some reason. And then like you said, like you dial it back to 1 and all of a sudden it's like, boom. Like when you go back to position 1, you're like, yes, there
Right.
it is.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I still probably 25% of the time wonder why I don't have any signal, and it's because I've plugged into the wrong side of my pedal board.
Nice.
So, we all have our things. Anyway, On that note, so we're gonna cut to a clip here of Steve playing that beautiful 72 345. Please subscribe to Steve's YouTube channel. He does, again, a lot of stuff with Line 6 Helix and with some of the other high-end modelers, as well as just some really awesome gear video. Thank you again for being on, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Jack. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. We'll talk to you soon.
Yes, sir.
Now to close out, I am going to give you some samples of the Veritone switch. So we're going to do both the middle and the bridge setting and just kind of play through the Veritone settings, you know, right from 1 to 6 and go back and really hear them back to back and what kind of a difference there are. Please let us know in the comments. What do you think of all this? Does an ES-345 need all these bells and whistles in order to be an ES-345? Is it otherwise just a 335? Do you totally not care and think this is ridiculous? But you know what? You needed something to watch, and I provided it. Me and Steve. We're doing a public service here. You're welcome.